Out of all the great empires of modern history, it seems like almost all of them had a hand in the game of colonization. But just what is colonization or a colonial empire? We can all agree that a country like Spain or Britain were the dictionary definition of colonialism, but what about the United States? A country that never had a monarchy, sure, but did indeed attempt to colonize various parts of the earth half a world away. Now, this brings us to perhaps the most famous and certainly one of the most infamous Islamic powers, the Ottomans, and their conquest and colonization of Egypt, Greece, and many other areas of the former Byzantine Empire. But these were not external colonies in the same style as the European colonies of the Americas. At various points, although not necessarily all simultaneous, the Ottoman Empire had control over the Balkans, parts of western Persia, the Caucasus, northern Abyssinia, Yemen, and large segments of North Africa, and the Ottomans certainly always had ambitions for expansion in the backs of their minds. But what if they went the extra mile and joined in on the all-you-can-eat buffet that is the New World? People like to think that the European powers like the English, French, and Spanish were united in their effort to put down the indigenous races of the Americas because of some notion that because they were both European, they would have some sort of sense of camaraderie in this unexplored section of the planet. Nothing could be further from the truth, as these empires fought each other constantly, and even in times of uneasy peace or the rare cases of cooperation, it really wasn't until after these countries gained independence that the Americas gained the status of a melting pot. The Ottoman Empire would have been no different, making temporary truces and fragile alliances with various Western European nations in order to further their own interests, and they were certainly powerful enough to successfully combat these nations back in the Old World for centuries, so why did they never venture too far from home? In 1840, right before the Ottomans' eventual decline, by all accounts, Christians made up approximately 40% of the population, pretty close to half, and Christians were scattered throughout its European, Asian, and African territory, with Coptic Orthodox Egyptians making up about a quarter of Egypt's population, Assyrians, Greeks, and Armenians making up around 30% of Anatolia, and of course in the Balkans, the Orthodox Slavs and Romanians vastly outnumbered Turkish migrants, or Albanian or Bosnian Muslims. Interestingly, Christians of all kinds actually outnumbered ethnic Turks as a whole in the Ottoman Empire at the time. Although, of course, the government was dominated by Islamic Turks pretty much everywhere, similar to how Western Europeans usually governed the territories incorporated into their empires, even when they were a minority. In fact, ethnic Turks made up less than a third of the entire population of the empire in the 1840s, with the next largest ethnicities being Arabs, Slavs of all kinds, including Yugoslavs and Bulgarians, Romanians, Armenians, and Greeks. When the Ottoman Turks conquered a new territory, for example in the cases of Bulgaria, Algeria, or Greece, a steady stream of Islamic ethnic Turks would migrate to the area, becoming the new dominant class. Because of this, the Ottoman territory was anything but a unified empire, and even many Islamic groups in the empire still had allegiances to their own nations rather than the greater Ottoman cause, and the Turks were constantly having to deal with interethnic conflict, civil wars, not to mention wars with other empires. The Ottomans simply didn't have the desire or resources to fund overseas expeditions that may or may not have provided them with any tangible benefit whatsoever. They already had large separatist movements growing in the Balkans with the Greeks and the Slavs, and later with the Armenians, Arabs, and Kurds of the Near East, and their main concerns were with trying to stabilize their Jenga tower of an empire, which is a similar reason as to why the Russians, a similarly large, powerful, but fundamentally unstable multi-ethnic empire, didn't really have a desire in gaining land halfway across the world. Well, there was Alaska, but that doesn't really count, seeing as to how it was essentially just an extension of their conquest of Siberia. Now, it is true that there were some Christian Greeks and Armenians, or non-Turkish ethnicities, who were extremely pro-Ottoman rather than holding regional separatist viewpoints, but these were probably in the minority. So in our scenario, a unified Ottoman Empire is a powerful Ottoman Empire. Also, no more wars with Russia, Persia, or Abyssinia if the Ottomans want to allocate their resources for the construction of a large, versatile navy, and this is possible seeing as to how the Ottoman Ottoman navy in reality was fairly localized, but they did travel as far as the East Indies in order to assist the Aceh sultans and engage in trade. So if the Ottomans were to unite as a solid power, it would seem they would have to give more political power and representation, maybe even more autonomy to ethnic and religious minorities, to at least somewhat appease the general populace and give them a sense of belonging in the empire, rather than just infidels to be subjugated. Another reason the Ottomans didn't really explore the Americas was the fact that although the Ottomans long dominated the Red Sea, Persian Gulf, Indian Ocean, and Eastern Mediterranean, the Atlantic was pretty much a no-go zone for them, as once the Ottomans denied access to the spice trade to the European powers through the East, they responded in kind. So all things considered, a less aggressive, more stable Ottoman Empire would have likely sought colonies east, where it would be entirely possible for them to have established forts and small port towns in the subcontinent, East Africa, and Southeast Asia, and most of the colonists in these new territories most likely would have been Arabs, Turks, or Armenians, seeing how in reality these three groups were heavily involved in trading and settling in faraway lands, such as the Hadramaut Arabs in Sumatra, the Swahili coast, or northern Sri Lanka, all three extremely diverse and disparate lands. But this isn't really all too different from what actually happened in reality, so what if things got really crazy? What if Ottoman navigators, using information gained by the Portuguese or otherwise, were able to cross the Pacific, which is possible, or round the Cape of Good Hope, which is even more probable, and land somewhere in the New World? Essentially, we have to look at areas of the Americas that were the last to be colonized or incorporated by the European powers, and believe it or not, there was actually a large section of territory that was never colonized, that being the region of Patagonia south of Argentina and Chile, and although officially claimed by Spain, it was not settled or actively governed until the latter two South American powers had already gained independence in the 19th century, and the British and Dutch both showed extensive interest in pulling this territory out from under the Spaniards' feet. Such a large stretch of land, inhabited only by the Mapuche and other various Amerindian tribes, could be ripe for the taking for potential Ottoman explorers if they were willing to settle this cold, rugged, and relatively isolated peninsula. In 1500, right at the start of the Age of Discovery, when the entire world began to be linked together, the Ottoman Empire had around 11 million inhabitants, which may not seem like a lot when compared to the 80 million in Turkey today, but compare this to some of the most powerful empires of the time, such as the Spanish at 8.5 million, Britain and Portugal at 3 million each, and only the French at 16 million had more, and their colonial presence in the America was actually rather limited compared to the other European powers. Now, of course, perhaps when the Ottoman Empire was in one of its strongest periods in the 1500s, they could have also joined in early, but as mentioned previously, they just didn't have much incentive in the first place, seeing as to how they were the arbiters of trade between the East and West, and the Iberians would have locked them out at Gibraltar anyways. But if they somehow managed to wrap around the Cape in southern Africa, it's foreseeable that they could even snag some of the highly desirable Caribbean islands for themselves, which would be quite surreal to say the least. As I discussed in a video a few weeks ago, the Ottomans definitely didn't shy away from the sub-Saharan slave trade, also not being afraid to engage in taking Christian children as slaves to be used as eunuchs or soldiers for their Janissary forces. But in actuality, the Ottomans would probably bring large number of African slaves from the east coast of Africa with them to the New World, so the demographics of the Ottoman West Indies, as I've dubbed it, wouldn't be too different from that of the British, Dutch, or French West Indies, only with a small Middle Eastern minority instead of a European one. And everyone's Muslim, of course, which would make for some very interesting modern relations indeed. As for the Southern Cone, as far as we can tell, plantation-style slavery was not so conducive in this region because of the climate and geography, so most likely we would see a flood of new Ottoman immigrants of all ethnicities into this new exotic territory bordering the Spanish Empire to the north, which really sounds quite insane to say out loud, but could definitely be possible had the empire taken a different direction early on. Speaking of that, the empire in the early 1800s had probably the most ethnically diverse population of any modern power in history, being spread out over 3 continents with ethnic Turks making up around 32%, followed by Islamic Arabs at 17%, Christian Slavs at 11%, which technically includes many smaller ethnicities, Romanians at 9%, Armenians at 6%, Greeks at 5%, and all others adding up to 20%. So would Ottoman colonies in Africa, India, Asia, or the Americas all be this ethnically diverse? Certainly not, but it's easy to imagine large numbers of Greek and Armenian merchants settling in these territories in order to become the economic middlemen and facilitate trade between the Ottomans and Christian Western European powers. And as to how we know that Ottoman citizens could have maybe not so easily made the trek to the New World en masse in order to populate a potential settler territory? Well, because they actually did it. As I've discussed in past videos, South Slavic groups, especially Croatians, created an ethnic enclave of settlement on the very edge of the world, on the island of Tierra del Fuego and neighboring Patagonia, only a stone's throw away from Antarctica. So many hundreds of thousands of Arabs, mostly Christians, fled the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century to Latin America, blending in with the white mestizo population that today they are considered by many Latino countries to be an integral part of their country's cultural heritage and have a very healthy representation in politics and government. Not only that, but there are also modest numbers of Greeks, Armenians, Bulgarians, Romanians, Assyrians, Turks, and Albanians located in the Americas today, with many having emigrated from Ottoman territory. 20 to 30 million people in the Americas today, most of them in countries south of the U.S. border, have ancestry from a country that is now a part of the Ottoman Empire, with the majority of these being Levantine Arabs from Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. So although the Ottomans may have never had any de facto colonies in the America, it would seem that without such a colony, more Ottoman citizens stepped foot in the Americas than any Ottoman colony would have ever attracted. So please let me know your thoughts on this interesting alternate history scenario. And for today's poll, tell me which region you think most probable for an alt-history Ottoman colony. And as always, thanks for watching everyone. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.